This is one of a series of panels and discussions organized by the Wiener Center under the general heading of 5 big ideas. There are a couple more left. Next week, we have a discussion on racial wealth gaps and a concluding one following that one. So if you're interested in these, make sure you check out the Wiener Center website. Today's topic is good jobs. I think this is an absolutely essential element of thinking about inequality. There are various ways in which we can address inequality, and often we focus on redistribution and transfers and the provision of social insurance as key elements of that. And obviously, there are many things that can be fixed in the way that US does these things. But I think if you want to also pull people out of poverty and create a broad and wide middle class, it's absolutely essential to give people access and opportunity to access good middle class jobs as well. It's only by creating productive employment opportunities that we can actually sustainably create better and fairer societies. And it's that a question of how do we create good jobs and how do we address some of the consequences of labor market polarization and lagging regions in the United States that today's discussion focuses on. I'm absolutely delighted that we managed to assemble what I would call my dream team of thinkers on this question of creating good jobs. Everything I know about the topic, I think I can say I've learned from the people on this panel, and other things that I think I know that may not be right, should not hold them responsible for those. But I'm actually very thankful to the Wiener Center for having given me this opportunity to bring together a wonderful panel. The speakers really don't need any introduction, so I'm just going to basically just tell you the order in which they're going to speak. We'll start with Tim Bartik from the Upjohn Institute, then Zeynep Ton from the Sloan School of Management at MIT, followed by Sandy Darity from Duke University, and finally Chuck Sabel from Columbia Law School. So we've given them very strict instructions that they should stick to 8 minutes, so we can have some discussion and then questions and commentary with the audience following the panel. So those of you in the audience, if you have questions that occur to you, please write them in the chat box, but we will also have an opportunity to raise your virtual hand after the panel has had one go around. So let's just start. And Tim, your floor is yours.
Thank you, Dani, and thank you for inviting me to this, and I look forward to the discussion. As Dani mentioned, I'm a senior economist at the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research, which is a nonpartisan research organization in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And most of my research over the years has dealt with state and local economic development policies and local labor markets. I have 4 slides, so let's see if this hopefully will work. My big idea on good jobs is that we need to bring more good jobs to the places where people most need those jobs, which are places with low employment rates, low employment to population ratios. And the second part of the idea is that the way to do that is not through business tax incentives so much, but through public services that enhance local business inputs. So, you know, this map shows the problem. A lot of the US has low employment rates, and this is prior to the current pandemic. The dark blue shows areas that are more than 5 percentage points below the national average, and the employment to population ratio or employment rate for so-called prime age workers ages 25 to 54. And the lighter blue shows areas, although they're not quite that distressed, still have employment rates well below the booming coastal cities. And so you look at that, it's a lot of the land area of the US. It's about 30% of the US population. It includes a lot of the rural South, a lot of Appalachia, as you might expect. A lot of the South really outside places like Nashville, Atlanta. But it also includes places like Detroit, Michigan, Flint, Michigan, includes a lot of upstate New York. And actually on the West Coast, outside of the booming coastal cities, it includes a lot of the West Coast, not only rural areas, but places like Fresno. So what do you do about the problem of geographic job distress? So the usual solution people talk about is to move people out of the area, but that doesn't work. Not only is it hard to move people, but there's this problem that there's a one-to-one relationship between the percentage population you move out and percentage employment. So if you move X percent of the people out of Flint, Michigan, for example, you also lower employment by X percent. So the employment rate in Flint is not improved. This doesn't help rebalance local labor markets. It may even make Flint worse off. It's ridiculous to think you're going to help Flint by encouraging people to move out. On the other hand, moving jobs in does work. There are a lot of studies showing that if you increase jobs in an area, the employment rate goes up not only in the short run, but in the long run, and lasts for at least 10 or 15 years, probably longer. And the relationship seems to be roughly that if we increase jobs in an area by 1%, that the employment rate goes up by about 0.2% in the long run. And in distressed local labor markets, this is higher by at least 50%. It's about 0.3%. So the benefit cost ratio of creating jobs in an economically distressed local labor market will be about 50% higher than an average local labor market. Now, we don't do much about this at the federal level in a serious way. There are a few token programs, but not really a serious effort. The main thing we do right now is state and local governments are pretty aggressive in offering business tax incentives at about $50 billion per year. And there are two problems with business tax incentives as a way to help distressed local labor markets. The first is this is not at all targeted at distressed areas. There's no sign that more distressed states offer higher incentives than less distressed states. Within states, there's not much targeting. So this is not a solution in terms of targeting distress. The other problem is because these incentives in many cases go to firms that would have located there anyway, the cost per job created after you allow for that is quite high, around $200,000 in present value cost per job created. And what I've argued in the past is that you can do a lot better by doing a variety of public services to enhance the quality of local business inputs. So what do I mean by that? That includes things like infrastructure. People like talking about that. It also includes customized job training, which local community colleges provide, business advice programs such as manufacturing extension services, land development things like brownfield redevelopment. All of these things can do a lot better, closer to $50,000 per job created. So I wrote a piece for Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program that came out in September, and I'm currently in the process of updating that piece. And the modified version is for a block grant to help distressed areas. And the block grant would include about $14 billion in annual funding for 10 years for local labor markets that are distressed. The 30% that I identified in that map, it would be designed to include all those areas, but target higher per capita funding for an area if an area has lower employment rates. It would provide support for providing these kind of public services to enhance job creation. It's a cost-effective way of doing things. And I estimate this would be able to close after 10 years about half of the employment rate gap. And I would also add another about $5 billion for distressed neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are not local labor markets, but so plopping jobs down in the neighborhood is not the issue so much, since most people don't work in the neighborhood they live in. But you do need to connect neighborhoods up with jobs throughout the local labor market. And I would include about $5 billion in annual funding for that, which essentially replicates what we did under empowerment zones. And the kind of services I would include would be information on job openings, job training programs, childcare, and transportation. And if that program was as successful as were empowerment zones, it would close about 60% of the employment rate gap. Now, this could be done by the federal government. It would be feasible. I mean, obviously within the federal budget, $19 billion a year is rounding error. But it's also feasible for state governments. There's really no reason why New York State or California couldn't do this. When you look at the numbers, the 18 billion, the amount of money involved is less than 3% of state government tax revenues, for example. And as I already mentioned, states are currently devoting about 47 billion a year to business tax incentives. So actually you could cut business tax incentives in half and you could do this. So essentially the idea I'm pushing is that we have a problem with good jobs. Places lack such jobs. There are programs that can solve it, and the way to do it is to target the dollars to distressed areas and to make sure the money is used for cost-effective way of creating jobs. And that can be done at the federal level, but I'm not holding my breath waiting around for the federal government to do it. I think states should do it. And it's really a matter of whether we have the political will to do this. Thanks, and I'll stop there so we have more time for discussion.
Thank you, Tim. It was perfect on the timing. Zeynep?
Thank you, Dani, for the invitation, and I'm really delighted to be part of this panel. As Dani mentioned, I'm an operations management professor at MIT Sloan and president of the nonprofit Good Jobs Institute. And my research focuses on how companies can use operations to create value for their customers, employees, and investors simultaneously. So since March, we started calling workers who supply our food, take care of our elderly, clean our hospitals, and sell us groceries essential workers. And we call them essential because they are essential to the functioning of our economy. Yet you wouldn't know they were looking at their wages because many earn below subsistence wages. In 2019, the median hourly wage of a health aide was $12.15. For a retail sales worker, it was $12.14. So that will make $25,000 annually if you work 40 hours a week, every single week. But even full-timers aren't scheduled 40 hours, and their schedules and incomes vary week to week. So these workers tend to find themselves in a vicious cycle. When wages are this low, they can't make ends meet and often have to work multiple jobs. Then they have health problems, lower cognitive functioning. All this hurts their performance at work and their ability to move up in the organization. They have attendance problems. They can't focus on the job. They can't be productive. And I see in lots of settings where they end up leaving involuntarily. And those who do stay often find it very difficult to move up. This is a big problem. This is a big problem for our economy because in 2019, 46.5 million Americans worked in, that's almost a third of the workforce, by the way, worked in occupations where the median wage was less than $15 an hour. That's a lot of people. And what's as bad is that a lot of the job growth is expected to come from low-wage sectors, like occupations like health aides, cleaning services, and labor occupations. And I just don't think we can have a strong middle class if we continue to have a third of the workforce lacking this kind of stability and mobility. So my big idea for good jobs is to turn these low-wage jobs into good jobs with higher wages, more stable schedules, and opportunities for success and growth. And doing that is not just good for workers and society. What I found in my research is that it can also be good for companies, because just like the vicious cycle that we see for workers, there is a vicious cycle of low investment and poor performance for companies. When I started my career looking at retail supply chains 20 years ago, I found operational execution problems that were costing companies millions of dollars. And when I studied what caused these problems, what were the drivers, a big part was high employee turnover and lack of investment in people. Meanwhile, while we see so many companies stuck in this vicious cycle, there are companies, and public and private companies, that operate in a virtuous cycle of high employee investment and high performance, while, and this is important, while competing on the basis of low cost. One example, Costco, one of the world's largest retailers, I think it's the third largest retailer right now. The average wage of an hourly worker there is $24, a lot higher than the $11.54 I cited before. A Quick Trip is a convenience store chain with gas stations. Starting full-time workers in Tulsa, Oklahoma can make $40,000 in their first year. So how do these companies do it? We know the formula. They combine investment in people with a set of operational choices that increase the productivity and contribution of their employees and ensure that their workers involve in improvements. And I call this combination of investment in people with operational choices the good job strategy. But obviously, we know that Quick Trips and Costco's are the exception rather than the norm. And that is the case for at least 3 reasons. The first is that, and this is not going to be a surprise to this crowd, companies don't have to offer good jobs to maximize profits. And the good job strategy requires prioritizing operational excellence, and it requires more managerial competence. And now there's plenty of evidence that managerial competence is not as common as we may think. The second reason is incentives for senior leaders get in the way of creating long-term value, especially when these senior leaders have such short tenures. Since founding the nonprofit Good Jobs Institute, I work with companies where even after seeing the numbers and believing in the competitive and financial case for investing in workers, companies didn't invest in people because executives didn't want to risk meeting their short-term performance targets. And then the third reason why Costco's and Quick Trips are not the norm, and I think this may be the toughest reason to overcome, is that a lot of executives don't believe in the ability or motivation of frontline employees to work hard, take pride in doing a good job, and take responsibility. So what do we do? Obviously, we can't, history shows us that we can't rely on business leaders alone to show this problem. And there is no silver bullet. We need strong policy, we need higher minimum wages, strong worker voice, MBA education needs to change. But I'll focus on one solution that I hope will be of interest to this group. I think we need to do everything we can to encourage companies to measure, pay attention to, and disclose metrics, but the right metrics on job quality. Metrics that are both material financially and for our society. And by we, I mean investors, company boards, labor groups, and policymakers. And if I had a magic wand, I would have firms measure, discuss, and disclose 3 metrics, and ideally do so by race and gender, because that matters too. The first is employee turnover, which has, of course, its direct costs, and those can be big. It's also not possible to pursue operational excellence and implement best practices when you operate with high employee turnover. At companies with high turnover, you find managers constantly fighting fires rather than improving performance or developing their people. The second is annual take-home pay. All companies should calculate the distribution of annual take-home pay for their hourly workers. And note that I said annual, not hourly pay, because many service workers are scheduled too few hours. And they should compare that pay to the budgetary needs of their employees. This exercise, I find, after working with a bunch of companies during the last couple of years, is often quite helpful to get executives to commit to raising wages. Because when we show them what percentage of their full-time employees make below subsistence wages, they're often disturbed and they want to do something. And then the third metric that I would promote is internal promotion. Companies like Costco, Quick Trip, several others I've studied, promote 100% from within, which forces them to invest in the development of their workers. So I think internal promotion is a great metric for investment and opportunity for growth within companies. I'll just say there is hope, even though we live in dark times, there is hope. Public companies already started disclosing median pay for their workers. So disclosing these 3 metrics could be the next step. There are lots of dialogues around ESG and ESG metrics, diversity and inclusion. So this is a good time to have conversations about even more metrics. And low-wage jobs are where a lot of Black and Hispanic workers and women tend to work. So we should be looking at their pay. We should be looking at their promotion rates. Last week, I was on a panel with the chief HR officer of Intel. And Intel is one of the companies that actually discloses take-home pay by gender and by race. And she said that they wanted to, they do that because they want to hold themselves accountable, and that their investors are increasingly asking for these data. So I think if more companies follow Intel's steps and combine pay with internal promotion and turnover data, we could make some progress toward good jobs.
Thank you very much, Zeynep. Third, we have Sandy Darity.
Thank you, Dani. So the coronavirus has brought the U.S. economy to the brink of economic collapse, and the CARES Act provided only temporary relief. Sustained national economic health requires a plan to give unemployed workers an opportunity to support themselves and their families with dignity. This is not something that is occurring in the present moment. We need to make permanent and universal the types of federal jobs programs that were inaugurated during the course of the Great Depression, particularly, as an example, the Works Progress Administration. So Congress should create a true public option for employment, an authentic right to work. It should guarantee an option for public sector employment for all adult Americans, an option that would include non-poverty wages and a benefits package that would be parallel to the one that's received by federal civil servants. It should provide a permanent public option for Americans to receive training, living wages, benefits, and better working conditions, including stable hours of work. This would effectively raise the floor on compensation for all workers. The private sector would be obligated to match the minimum conditions with respect to safety, wages, hours of work, and benefits. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to hire anyone. This would effectively eliminate bad jobs. The public sector would compete directly with the private sector for employment, particularly for workers who are toward the lower end of the wage scale. These workers could perform the types of tasks that would be socially beneficial. This would include care work, professionalization of child and elder care. It would provide the opportunity to promote a green economy and solarization. It would provide a workforce that could contribute to the conservation of natural resources. It would provide an opportunity to have a workforce that was poised to assist in the event of natural disasters and other emergency relief requirements. It could support investments in education, health, and culture, including an opportunity to provide artists and entertainers with employment that might be jeopardized in downturns of the type that we're experiencing now, where mass gatherings are not a healthy option. And in addition, it could perform the classical tasks that's been associated with public sector employment, support physical infrastructure. Indeed, it would be a better response to the current crisis, like the pandemic, by eliminating the need for poorly paid, unsafe employment. It would establish a public payroll that would have been in place so that in the event of a pandemic, people could be moved rapidly onto that payroll, having steady income that would supplement their well-being, rather than the types of sporadic supports that we currently are providing. It would minimize evictions, and it would minimize the likelihood of the loss of health insurance. The current system of income supports is predicated on the notion that people must be exposed to poverty before they can actually receive any form of relief. But the federal job guarantee would prevent exposure to poverty, particularly working poverty. It would eliminate the prospect of working poverty occurring at all. And this is a policy that's remarkably popular, despite the fact that it has not been widely seized upon by by aspiring politicians. Polls regularly indicate that upwards of 70% of Americans are in favor of the federal government providing a public sector option for employment for any American who so desires such an opportunity. 40 to 50% of Republicans consistently indicate that they support such an option, in excess of 80% of Democrats. So there's a strong puzzle as to why it's not a cause célèbre for public officials to be supporting a federal job guarantee. I would add that it's critical that the federal job guarantee would ensure that people would have an adequate quantity of jobs, an adequate quality of jobs, and adequate access to them. The private sector always falls short on the quantity end. Otherwise, we would not have a situation where 15% of all employed persons actually work for the public sector, whether it's at the federal, state, or local level. This would provide us with a direct route to full employment rather than the indirect reliance on stimulus packages, on other types of approaches like subsidies that effectively attempt to bribe the private sector into doing the right thing. The Phillips curve, as I've said on other occasions, would become vertical at a zero rate of unemployment.
Thank you very much, Sandy. Last speaker on our panel, Chuck Sabel.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And what I'm going to say comes from a joint paper with Dani. And as he indicated, that means we build a great deal on what Tim and Zeynep have told you, and from whom we've learned an immeasurable amount. So let me start by just recalling the large background of this discussion, the framing of a debate that's in some ways all too familiar. So we start out by postulating or acknowledging that the welfare macroeconomic model of managing growth in the advanced countries has broken down. And likewise, the industrialization-led model of development in developing economies has run out of steam. And the result of that is in both in advanced and in developing economies, the emergence of a new and persistent kind of dualism in which one part of the society contributes to and benefits enormously from innovation, and another large part does neither. And this dualism in advanced and developing countries alike has now taken on the effects of the dualism has taken on constitutional dimensions. It encourages the development of populist movements, various stripes that in one way or another threaten the foundations of democracy. All of that seems completely evident. We propose to address this productively through actual restructuring of the economy. To return to a point that Dani made at the outset, many of the efforts, and we share fully in their ambitions and hopes, many of the current efforts to address this same set of problems focus on one form of redistribution or another, either redistribution to those who've been the most manifest victims of injustice, frontline communities in the Green New Deal, to the middle class at the mercy of the plutocrats and the monopolies, or to those who've just been disempowered, not just, but have been disempowered, and some combination of economic redistribution and rewiring the circuits of power is thought to be the answer. It's not that we think that none of that matters. We think that no solution that looks completely away from these deep questions of injustice and exclusion can possibly work in the long run. But we also believe deeply, as Dani said, that without access to good jobs, the middle-class jobs, meaning a restructuring of the economy that provides those jobs as a matter of business course, and not as an exceptional grant, that the constitutional problem it can't be addressed. So we're aiming for a productive response, and then when to come to a way of thinking about a productive response where we start with again a very familiar idea, the notion that the spread of bad jobs creates a monstrous negative externality, and conversely, the creation of good jobs is an enormous positive externality. And in neither case, neither in avoiding the negative externality nor in achieving the positive externality, can we count on the private investment decisions of firms, because by definition, there's a gap between the public and the private return in each case, which produces the externality. We think further that the classic responses to externalities like a Pigouvian tax don't work because the solutions are high dimensional, or put it another way, they're very large structural problems, meaning that multiple constraints have to be relaxed, both on the side of encouraging building skills and capacities in the workforce, and then equally, as Zeynep emphasized, in helping business firms find their way to strategies which are notionally in their interest, but inaccessible given their own current lack of managerial and other capacities to find the solutions, to make solutions accessible, which would then, once accessible, become self-actuating through the normal investment decisions. So now there's a twist in the argument, and something which makes it both a big idea and hard to package as the normal big idea, because we believe that the governance, when you have high dimensional solutions, and when you have to provide, for example, complex services to both the workforce on the one side and to firms, medium, but also large firms in many cases on the other. When you have to do that, you can't rely on any solution that can be institutional solution that can be fully defined ex ante. Tim gave us a good example of the kind of effort that is absolutely indispensable to framing what kind of a general program needs to be created, but interestingly left out of his presentation for purposes of this discussion, not in other presentations of his, is any mention of the need for place-based policies, meaning policies whose essence is precisely to adjust very general ideas, providing business services that help firms find their way to good jobs, which are profitable investments, or workers in neighborhoods to find their way to skills which are actually needed by emerging industries. Those kinds of institutions, which are of course absolutely indispensable to making the program work, don't appear in the short version of the big idea. It's not a question of incompatibility. It's just the notion of a big idea suggests that you have to say something which can be framed in a way that avoids this kind of governance detail. Unfortunately, we think there's no way around it. We think that the governing principles for these kinds of institutions to start with a serviceable provisional setup and to improve, learn as they go, and learn crucially from the successes and failures of others in like situations is actually very widely diffused in the modern economy. It's a signal feature of what we think of as the advanced sector in the modern economy, to learn under uncertainty. And we suggest in the paper how those principles can be borrowed for the purposes of achieving a good jobs program. So that's our big idea, with the caveat that packaging it fully as a big idea conceals some of its goodness, if not its bigness. And I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Chuck, and lots of really wonderful ideas here. And what I'm struck by is how I think they're all complementary, and I think there is, I think some of that was reflected in the discussion in the chat box. And I don't think I'm presuming much when I say that all the panelists would agree that the specific elements that they've highlighted are complementary to the other views that the other panelists have emphasized, in the sense that, sort of focusing on sort of the regional dimension of employment is, would, in some sense, the pressures on that would be some alleviated if in the presence of a federal job guarantee, and vice versa. That if the firms working on their own in the way that Zeynep outlined were engaged in good job strategies, that having the support of public local development agencies providing the kinds of support, including sort of business support, would be a component potentially drawing in more firms into sort of high wage good job strategies. And finally, if you were to really want to significantly increase the supply of good jobs, you would also need to, in some sense, create more productive firms as well. So, good jobs have to come with more productive firms, and so there has to be an element of sort of targeting productivity in the smaller and medium-sized firms as well, which is partly what Chuck was getting at as well, and on the firm leg of this good job strategy. So that all seems to me to be fairly complementary. There's one institution that I think Richard Murnane in the chat box raised, and I want to ask you sort of the role of labor unions in all of this. And it has not been explicitly brought out. To what extent? I think Dick's question was targeted at Zeynep in terms of what is the role that trade unions might play. But I'd like you really to ask that question to all the panelists. What's the role of trade unions in the kinds of strategies you've laid out? And broadening from the trade unions, can we also think of sort of labor market regulations and sort of more institutionalized labor market practices that come out of federal government regulations? Is that also a complementary element to this? But maybe I'll start with Zeynep, since I think Dick Murnane's question was directed specifically to you. What's the role of labor unions?
And as you've mentioned in your question, Dani, I think both labor unions and federal government have to play enough role. Otherwise, we're not going to have large-scale adoption of good jobs. And collective bargaining has disappeared from low-wage sectors for a while, and we see the downside of that. And stronger worker voice will certainly help. Having said all that, I'm not an expert on the labor policies, so maybe I'll leave it to the other panelists to comment more on the role of the labor unions.
But do you see resistance on the part of the firms that you work with on?
Yes, yes, and it's very interesting because in the United States there has not been a single company that I've worked with, and I've worked with quite a few during the last 5-6 years, where the executives would welcome unions. And interestingly so, even high road employers, the good jobs companies, tend to when you ask them, why is it that you offer high wages and high things, and they talk about the financial case, they talk about the competitive case, they talk about the moral case. Sometimes they also talk about how this is one way to keep labor out. So there has been resistance on the part. Yes, there has been some resistance on the part of executives, for sure, that I've seen.
Tim?
Well, I guess what I would say about the labor unions, I think that if we deal with the problem of really high non-employment rates in certain local labor markets, that gives workers more bargaining power in such labor markets. So that would include bargaining power through unions, but it would also, in general, would put upward pressure on wages. It would make employers more interested in doing customized job training and doing job training. It would make them more interested in Zeynep's good job strategy. So I think it would have a number of beneficial effects. And I also could imagine some of the economic/workforce development strategies that I'm pushing through this block grant proposal, that if that was pushed, it could be combined with state policies to push up the minimum wage, to set wage standards for the jobs that they're trying to create through economic development policies. So if you can create a robust market for new job creation, you're better able to impose some standards on what the quality of that job creation is.
Yes, Sandy, I know you want to come in on the trade union question, but I might also add, a couple more questions. One, I know you answered in the chat box, but if you could just say something about the cost of a federal jobs guarantee. And second, to the extent that the problem of jobs is, as Tim emphasized, is mainly a regional one. That it's really that sort of, it's really local labor markets that are distressed, and having a federal job guarantee might be a poor match for that problem. That might be, how would you address that criticism?
So, I think that in the midst of downturns, the regional nature of the jobs crisis becomes more national. So this is less the case in more prosperous times where distressed areas seem to continue to exist. But during periods in which the economy goes into a significant downturn, I think there's a much more widespread condition of joblessness that's relevant, or not just joblessness in and of itself, but the quality of jobs that are available actually deteriorate for all workers under those circumstances. And so I think that when we start thinking about trying to preserve quality employment at all times, we do have to have a national program. We also have to have a national program to mitigate the need that people might experience to try to migrate to those particular parts of the country where there is a better or superior jobs policy. Particularly if we're concerned about people leaving rural communities, which is what customarily has happened, by having a somewhat uniform policy in terms of guaranteeing work, we reduce that likelihood. In terms of the question about the trade unions, I tried to indicate in the chat that a federal job guarantee would strengthen the collective bargaining power of trade unions, precisely because employers could not be as effective in applying the threat to lose your job or the threat to fire under a circumstance where there was a federal job guarantee. With respect to the cost of a federal job guarantee, in the work that we've done, we estimate that the upper bound of federal job guarantee expenditure, particularly in a situation where we have mass unemployment, would be somewhere in the vicinity of $750 billion. That would be the equivalent of the federal government's budget for anti-poverty programs. Since I'm somewhat sympathetic to modern monetary theory, I'm not particularly concerned about the size of the budget that would be required to make something beneficial like this occur. But you could virtually offset much of the expense of this program by reducing some of the conventional social programs that are associated with trying to maintain people's income. And I would add that the federal job guarantee is an automatic stabilizer. And so the expense of the program would, of course, rise during periods in which unemployment is increasing. but it would decline during periods that are more prosperous, where the extent of unemployment is decreasing significantly.
Sandy, while you're on it, I just noted there's a question from Jenny Mansbridge about what about the criticism that federal minimum wage ignores cost of living in different areas, therefore should be a matter for the states. Presumably that would also go for a federal job guarantee as well.
So it's possible to make some adjustments that are based upon local cost of living. Again, I'm a bit nervous about the extent to which you do that because of the possibility of inducing intrastate migration. But you certainly could make some adjustments with the wage payments based upon local cost conditions. So, for example, perhaps the minimum compensation associated with a federal job guarantee would be somewhat higher in New York City than it would be in my hometown of Durham, North Carolina. But I would also add that the federal job guarantee is actually a superior method for trying to establish a floor on compensation to the conventional minimum wage for two reasons. First, the minimum wage has no bite if you don't have a job at all. And secondly, the minimum wage does not guarantee people a sufficient number of hours of work to ensure that they will be eligible for benefits. And so in some sense, the federal job guarantee is a more effective way of establishing minimum standards of compensation for employment.
Chuck, do you want to, we started on the role of labor unions. Do you want to come in on sort of what a role, if any, labor unions might play and the kind of strategy that you were discussing?
Yes, I would. I think this is a fundamental question, and any comprehensive effort to mobilize the nationally to help firms adjust and to help workers adjust it inevitably invites the question, what about labor? And in an earlier period, it would have been completely straightforward to start with labor and to say that labor should be part of a business labor coalition that would, for example, mandate Zeynep's 3 indicators as kind of a starting point for national economic policy, and then add the block grant, and then proceed from there. And now, of course, the idea of such a coalition is inconceivable, not just in the United States, but in countries that were more renowned for having these kinds of neo-corporatist arrangements. Now, but then the question is, what is the role for labor? And I have an ambiguous feeling about this. On the one hand, nothing could be more clear than the fact that American business in particular, more than many, at least European counterparts, is anti-labor, and it can be ruthless in using the labor law to suppress unions. So we know that. On the other hand, the unions are not terrific on the question of training and advocating for the interests of low-wage workers outside the union. There are some exceptions, 9 to 5 and so on. But if you look closely, first of all, the public service unions, especially teachers unions, public sector unions, teachers unions are often anti-reform. You can criticize the education reformers all you want, but the unions are not, often don't seem to be taking the part of the public. And when it comes to old industry, the traditional industry, there have been very fitful efforts, sometimes quite encouraging, but never carried through to establish really good training programs, not just for incumbent workers, but to begin to open them up in a broader apprenticeship way and so on. So I would say, though this is completely unfair, I would say there's a problem on both sides, not an equal problem, but I think that it would be easier to make what should be the completely straightforward case for institutional participation by labor if labor or taking more initiative in addressing these problems within its particular spheres of activity?
Thank you, Chuck. One of the questions that one of the puzzles that I'm struck by is how meager the federal response is, both relative to the sort of the scale of the challenge and the availability of the kind of remedies that I think are well represented sort of in this panel. I think, Tim, you mentioned, I mean, $18 billion is nothing, for the federal budget. And yet, you seemed already, ready to give up the idea that the federal government might actually, even an incoming one, might be willing to do that. So you thought that maybe the states will do it. Sandy, you mentioned that this is really, the federal jobs guarantee is a very popular idea. You mentioned it explicitly as a paradox. I wonder to what extent, sort of the problem is that the issues that we're discussing are often cast in terms of social policy and addressing inequality, as opposed to addressing the productive base and innovation of the country. Sort of when we think about innovation, then we senators and congressmen are quite willing to talk about programs in the hundreds of thousands of hundreds of billions of dollars. And as there was some discussion in the chat box about how, in fact, the programs that we're talking about are not truly are not just addressing social needs and inequality. They're not simply social policy. They're also policies addressing economic underperformance, because in a way, I mean, as Chuck put it, they're addressing externalities, and so it's actually efficiency enhancing, because the scarcity of good jobs produces huge local and regional health, social effects, and in the sort of broader political fabric of the nation. There are all these missing opportunities of increasing firm productivity that Zeynep mentioned, with sort of better production operations management, and addressing firms' needs through the kinds of public inputs that Tim was talking about, or the productivity enhancing strategies that Chuck was talking about. So if we see these remedies more as really addressing productive innovation tasks, and not just simply as addressing sort of the bottom of the labor market or social needs. Maybe that's sort of one explanation as to how the framing has worked against these kinds of remedies, and a different kind of framing might that be politically more saleable and address a bigger federal response. I don't know. I mean, I just want to get back to the panel as to why they think the federal response has been so meager. Tim?
Well, I agree with you that you could frame this in terms of efficiency. And by the way, I would point out that even though I'm only talking about 19 billion, that when you look at the amount per capita to be involved, if you did this over a 10-year period, it's a significant amount of money. It's on the order of what TVA did at its peak in the early 1950s when peak funding existed. It's not dissimilar per capita to the Marshall Plan, for that matter. So it actually is a significant amount of money. And I agree with you. This should be framed not simply as an equity issue, but how do we build on the human capital of this country by bringing jobs to people, increasing their job skills, reducing social problems in these areas, increasing the productivity of the economy. And I think you can even connect this with increasing the productivity of the high-tech economy. There's a really good book, Jumpstarting America, by Simon Johnson and Jonathan Gruber, that talks about decentralizing high-tech investments, which I think fits in with what I'm pushing as well. Mark Morrow at Brookings and Rob Atkinson have been pushing similar ideas. I mean, I think it's arguable that we would have more efficient, better high-tech if we diversify a little bit and didn't have all the same ideas in the same place all the time. So, I think we need to recognize that helping people where they live is not only equitable, it's also economically efficient. by helping build up their skills and reducing social problems in those areas. It increases the productivity of the overall country.
Anybody else? Zeynep?
Yeah, I have a feeling there are two types of problems here. The first one is when again, coming back to our assumptions about people and the work that they do, I think traditionally we have called some jobs unskilled jobs. And those have been the jobs that were taken by immigrants, women, and Black workers. And we tend to have assumptions about, I think, people who have these jobs that haven't changed so much over the years. So I think that's one problem that that prevents us from, looking at these 46.5 million people who work in low wage jobs. The other is, and I stopped going to conferences around future of work. It's so cool when you talk about efficiency and innovation and pretending as if the economy is generating so many great jobs. We just don't have enough people, enough educated, skilled people to have them. And I think solutions like this, we just upskill, educate, seems a lot easier to do, and is palatable to the companies, and is palatable to politicians. And we tend to focus on those easy things rather than, look, if we take a huge company, a low wage company, and we ask them to provide good jobs now, they have to make lots of changes in the design of the work that they do. That's not an easy thing to do. And no one wants to get close to that problem. Innovation, upskilling, much cooler topics to talk about.
Thank you. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, I do, because it just follows directly on what Zeynep said. I think that's really putting the finger on the issue. The question is the one that you posed, Dani, which is how can it be? There's a lot of $100 bills lying on the table here if what people are saying is right. And I don't think that's it's hard to say that there's nothing to this claim. So if there's such a big efficiency gain, and you might at least expect the beginning of a political response to address the externality, and we're not seeing it. And I think that I'm going to rephrase what Zeynep said slightly. I think that the partisans of this kind of reform measure, like the Democratic Party, are so far away from these working class communities and this kind of industry, and so absorbed in the problems of the struggling professional classes, that most of the programs are really, the Democratic programs are designed to help struggling professionals, or to turn low income communities into budding professionals by free pre-K and then free college, and doing something about public education, as though you could do that and then you would be on the track to escaping these kinds of communities and this whole way of life generally. So if you combine the sort of political proclivities that come out of where the attachments of the Democratic Party have come to be, with the intrinsic difficulty, as Zeynep was just emphasizing, of actually facing up to what it's going to take to reshape the productive base of the economy, it's all too easy to go with this, job training is on the checklist of things that have to be done after free college, after and so on and so forth. And I know it's a little unfair to blame the lack of take up of one's favorite program on politicians who just don't get the point. But here the silence is so persistent in the face of such a big problem, including a big electoral problem, that one has to wonder.
Question, Tim, to you from Gordon Henson, and I'm just going to read it. We know from research using Bartik instruments, the econometric technique named after you, that positive local labor demand shocks in distressed communities help raise employment population ratios. These impacts are based not on evaluations of policy interventions, but on random shocks to national industries. Do we know that the types of policies you suggest would have comparable employment impacts as these random shocks? Or is this sort of experimentation something states needs to be trying to do?
Well, I should say that I didn't name the Bartik instrument, although I have to admit I don't mind the name. Yeah, I think there's no reason to think. I mean, the whole idea of looking at shocks to national demand for an industry, I think there's no reason to think that the effect of these local policies would differ. When we increase jobs in export-based industries, whether that happens due to you happen to get lucky that the industries your area happens to specialize in happen to do well nationally, that's the basic idea of the Bartik instrument. Or whether it happens that you actually build up an export-based industry through these business services. You help it through customized job training. You help through manufacturing extension services. You put in infrastructure. You redevelop brownfields so you have additional land available for development. All those things makes your export-based sector more competitive. And when you make your export-based sector more competitive and expand jobs, it's going to have multiplier effects on the local economy. I think it's exactly the same thing that happens due to national shocks to demand for your industry. And I think the evidence is it would have the same kind of effects. It would build up job skills, both in the short run and long run, and it reduces social problems such as substance abuse and crime. So it has all these spillover effects, both economic multipliers in the ordinary sense and social multipliers in the broader sense.
Thank you. One thing that we haven't talked about, and there was a couple of questions and comments about this in the chat, is new technologies and the direction that technology is taking. A lot of the labor market polarization and asymmetric regional effects in labor markets have been linked to ongoing trends in technology, the skill bias, the automation, new AI technologies benefiting primarily the more skilled professionals, and then sort of fomenting perhaps the concentration of industries. So the question I want to ask you is to what extent either the kinds of things that you've already talked about or additional remedies might help in terms of giving a kind of a possibly reorienting the direction of technological change in a more worker-friendly or employment-friendly direction. I mean, it was implicit in what Zeynep said. In fact, actually, it was explicit that when firms face choices with respect to, how to reorganize and what, sort of what kind of operations, what kind of technologies to adopt and so forth. They have a range of choices, and some of them are going to be more friendly to workers. It's going to be, more in line with creating good jobs instead of, lower minimum wage jobs. More in line with skilling and more in line with career progression and similarly at the federal level, there might be lots of things that the federal government could do in terms of its innovation programs that are much more targeted at developing AI, for example, that's much more complementary to middle skills or to low skills as opposed to replacing low or middle skilled workers. So I wonder if you can sort of address this question of whether that's an additional instrument, or whether in what you've suggested that sort of having an influence on the direction of technological change is also something that could play a role. Who wants to come in? I know it's a tough one.
I'm happy to talk about the role of technology in creating good jobs. Not sure, not about the theCnology strategy, but I had the US CEO of Walmart in my class last week and their COO, and they talked about, and I'm going to talk about how technology can be great for good jobs, especially in low wage sectors. So they talked about how when they started working 30 years ago, the biggest room in the store was cashiers, right? There used to be so many cashiers, and now when you look at that store, there are so few cashiers, but there are even more people who are picking up orders for customers, or who are meeting customers at the curbside, delivering them the food and the necessities that they need. So technology is shaping the role of workers, and it could create higher productivity and enable higher wages. In fact, when they were at Sam's Club, they used technology to be able to justify high wage investments. So where I think technology becomes a problem, at least in the sectors that I have studied, is when companies do not involve their workers in either finding, adapting, or scaling technologies. And that ends up hurting both the workers, and at times it ends up hurting the companies as well, because they end up adopting technologies that don't create value for their customers. It's just a substitute for labor, and it ends up not even having cost savings that they have. Of course, the tax policies encourage them to invest more in those technologies, the social technologies, as our colleague Daron would say, than to invest in wages and workers.
Tim?
I guess, well, two points I want to make about this technology bit. One is that I noticed the MIT's Task Force on Work of the Future report came out last week, and that was an interesting report. And one thing they mentioned at the end was things about maybe the tax treatment, depreciation allowances could be cut back on, and we could have more subsidies for customized training as a way of tweaking incentives somewhat for firms. I also would say some of the services I'm talking about, what you emphasize in those services can affect choices as well. So manufacturing extension programs where you provide business advice to small and medium-sized manufacturers, I think when they originally conceived of, they were thought of as technology transfer organizations that would help manufacturers adopt new technology, potentially automate a lot of jobs out of existence. And in practice, a lot of times they've had more of their impact either through helping manufacturers pivot who they sell to. So for example, in Michigan, they've done some work in Grand Rapids, helping auto suppliers pivot to doing medical instruments. You know, if you're bending metal or molding plastic for autos, you can also bend metal or mold plastic for medical instruments. So that is not, you know, automating jobs out of existence. Manufacturing extension service also, in some cases, there's interesting experiments with trying to use them to link those employers up with better training approaches, better human resources approaches, which potentially make workers more productive. So I think we can have conversations about how we organize manufacturing extension services, and are we encouraging automation, or are we alternatively encouraging other things that might make the business more productive in other ways and actually augment worker productivity?
Thank you, Sandy.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think Zeynep's point was that frequently the innovations that are associated with automation actually create a new set of jobs that potentially can offset the jobs that are lost. The difficulty, I think, in the present moment is the importance of a particular form of technical innovation that's taking place, which is associated with the use of artificial intelligence. And I think it's the presence of artificial intelligence that leads some people to predict that this new wave of automation actually will have the effect of reducing the number of jobs that need to be performed by human beings. And I think that that's an important question. I don't know the full answer, but I think that in such a climate, a federal job guarantee would be an ideal way to construct or to try to explore what types of employment still is needed to be done by human beings. It's my hope that we will not take care work out of the hands of the human touch. But who knows? That's a possibility. But I think that in an environment where automation is actually on net destroying job opportunities, the presence of a federal job guarantee is terrific. And I think it may be a better idea than in isolation, setting up a universal basic income, because I think that the effect of the latter is just to make us a society of pure consumers.
Yes. So Chuck, I don't know if you wanted to come in on technology, but I'll give you the word next as part of the final set of comments. So I'll give each one of you just 30 seconds to tell us what your hopes from the new administration is, and whether you see significant movement on any of the issues that we've talked about from the incoming administration. Let's do this in reverse order from the first set of initial comments. So Chuck, you go first.
So let me say, I guess the easiest part of this, I think, is going to be the technology, because this kind of technology is extremely plastic, and how you use it determines what it becomes. And there are enough alternative uses loose in the world so that I don't think the choices are going to be ultimately constrained by the availability of technologies for pursuing a good job strategy. I think the deep constraints are going to be political and social. And I think that the question of good jobs is not going to be resolved separately from the question of what kind of country we want to become. I think that there's going to be an ongoing debate about this for a long time, as far as the eye can see. And I think that my deep hope is that we, as a country, aim for a solution that is economically viable, in the sense that the forms of employment and the life chances that they create are fully in accord with the kinds of citizenship that we all want to value.
Thank you, Chuck. Let's see, Sandy?
I think that one of the things that's really disturbing about the present moment is the sporadic and uncertain nature of the types of income supplements that are being provided to Americans in the midst of the pandemic. And I think that we need a process that would provide people with sustained and consistent opportunities to receive income. And that's one of the reasons that I'm an advocate of a federal job guarantee. It would be a better world if we had already had such a policy in place, but there's nothing that prevents us from adopting it now. And I will add that Senator Cory Booker has legislation that's been put forward in the Senate to introduce a test program or a set of demonstration projects for a federal job guarantee. And in the House, one of the congressional representatives actually is putting forward a bill for a full-scale federal job guarantee. And I think we may need to leapfrog Senator Booker's proposal and move directly to a full-scale federal job guarantee, particularly in the current environment. But it would be something that would be a useful social protection at all points in time.
Thank you, Sandy. Zeynep?
So the 30-second recommendation, I think first take care of the workers who are not able to work right now, and enable them to live their lives and safely. And then to really focus on the real problems that the workers that we have been talking about have been facing during, in the next 4 years, and related to, higher minimum wages, legislation around scheduling, smart scheduling laws, childcare for workers, especially for lower wage workers, and changes to the tax code so that companies favor the worker investments versus technology investments would be what I hope this administration does.
Thank you, Zeynep. Tim?
You ask what I hope from the new administration, and I know that President-elect Biden has talked a lot about bringing the country together. Obviously, a lot of this has nothing to do with place-based policy. It has to do with solving the virus, has to do with bringing the macroeconomy back. But even after we deal with those problems, we do have the problem of the left behind places. And I think the U.S. ignores the problem of 1/3 of the country left behind at its peril, not just for the economic and social costs for those areas, but for the overall social and political cost of this country. We need to make sure that we include everyone in this national story. Otherwise, we will not be able to bring people together. We're going to have continued political unrest.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you to all the panelists, Tim Bartik, Zeynep Ton, Sandy Darity, Chuck Sabel, not only for advancing really strong ideas, but also doing so very, very compellingly. I think I've really learned a lot, and I'm sure that our audience has benefited as well. So we're really truly in your debt, and keep doing the great work, and this is wonderful. Thanks also on behalf of the Wiener Center. On the chat box, you'll see the details for the next couple of sessions. But for now, let's just give a round of silent applause for our panelists and thank them. Thank you.